Thanks so much, Cannon. It's great to be here and great to be with everybody who's on the webinar today and might watch it later. This is a topic that is incredibly important to me because I struggled and juggled with migraine in the workplace, in the corporate workplace for 22 years, and then in nonprofit. And advocacy thereafter has been less of a struggle, and I'll get into the reasons why a little bit later. But we're here to help as many people, individuals who are employees, as well as those who are employers, trying to figure out how to create happier, more productive workplaces.
Thank you so much, Paula. And now I am pleased to introduce Bernadette, who is a migraine advocate and creator on social media, and has an account called Chronic Accounts, where she discusses her life with chronic migraine and really tries to use her position of influence to educate and advocate for migraine.
Hi, my name is Bernadette. I've worked in public, private, and international schools as a classroom teacher since 2009. And most recently, I've been starting a new journey being self-employed, and I have been living alongside migraine disease since childhood.
Thank you so much for sharing. So Bernadette, you were a teacher for many years. I believe it was for 10 years, and your migraine disease really progressed during that time. And what a lot of employers and managers don't understand is that migraine is a neurobiological disease, and most of the time it has a genetic predisposition. Most people think that migraine is kind of random events that can happen sporadically and that just about anyone can get it and that it's a bad headache. But one of the messages that you continue to push is that migraine is a neurobiological disease and that we need to start thinking about migraine as though it is something more similarly to someone having MS or lupus. So if you could just discuss what it was like to be a teacher and not having the accommodations that you need for work.
While she's getting her audio together, I'll just jump in and mention that education is the number 2 sector in which people with migraine work. So it's really important to have her here to share with us today kind of what it's like to live with migraine and try to work in that environment.
Thank you, Paula.
Yay.
That's absolutely right. Right. It's a condition where it impacts, women 3 to 4 times more. And there's a lot of women teaching. So it's a really important point. So I actually taught for 13 years, and my entire teaching career I taught with chronic migraine. And chronic migraine is when you have 15 or more attack days per month. But unfortunately, during that time, I was not educated in migraine disease, which meant I wasn't empowered to ask for accommodations. I had absorbed the migraine stigma so deeply that I was mortified when I had to take off days for migraine attacks. And these were attacks that were severe and completely disabling. But it didn't matter because all I knew was that it would not be understood by the people I worked with, or even it wasn't understood by myself even. But I did have colleagues that were open about taking days off for migraine attacks, and they were completely judged by our peers. And because I was quiet about living with migraine, they would speak about it openly in front of me. They would talk about these people, like how lazy they were, how they were faking it, how they just wanted to get an excuse to do less work. And I ended up absorbing the migraine stigma even further because of that. And as a teacher, you only get a handful of sick days, right? Because you have breaks, you have summers off. So you only get a small amount to begin with. So what do you do when you're chronically ill and you're a teacher? You show up to work even when you're incredibly sick. I would only take off work when my head pain was explosive, when my limbs felt like cement, where it was like impossible to move, and I had cyclical vomiting, like a disabling trifecta. That's when I called in sick for a work day. And I was embarrassed, like I was using an excuse, even though I was completely disabled. But because of the migraine stigma, that's how it impacted me. And I would return to work as soon as possible, whether the attack had broken or not. I was there showing up. There was a morning when I went to work and I had to commute by bus that day, and the bus triggered motion sickness, which triggered an attack. I remember trying to hold in throw up, and I had to run off the bus, throw up in a bush, and then I went and I taught the rest of the day. There were other days where I would throw up in between classes and continue teaching. I'm using this as an example because this is something that you might have experienced, right? Throwing up is not a symptom that is unique to migraine disease, or whether you have a chronic illness or not. Most likely you've experienced it. And that's why I'm using that as just one example of migraine, a symptom that you might understand. But the reality is migraine is a neurological disorder that causes dysfunction of the central nervous system. It's a full body disease. And when attacks are not treated, the brain can become more and more sensitive and more overreactive to triggers. And migraine disease can easily progress, leading to a greater level of disability. And whether it's realized or not, workplace accommodations are absolutely a huge piece of that puzzle that can help a person maintain control of their migraine disease or be part of the reason why it spirals out of control. By not treating my attacks, by always pushing through them, by not seeking accommodations to help mitigate or prevent attacks during the workday, it led to my condition progressing and becoming more severe. And by the summer of 2020, I was living with a nonstop severe attack that never broke. And thankfully, because it was the first year of the pandemic, I was actually given permission to teach and work from home. I successfully taught all of my classes in a location where I could control my environment, where there weren't any extra aggravating smells, noises, lights to trigger my pain levels to spike even higher, where I could treat myself with my neuromodulation devices and ice in between classes while I completed my prep work. The next school year, I was still stuck in a severe intractable attack, and teachers were no longer allowed to work remotely. But I was still housebound at this point due to the severity of my migraine disease, and I had to go on full sick leave. After a year of sick leave, I made the heartbreaking decision to leave a profession that I adored and loved, a profession that I'm expertly trained in, a profession that I excel in. To give you a better sense of this, when I moved abroad in 2014, after working at a public school for 5 years, they offered me a leave of absence. This is when they hold your job because they don't want to lose you as an employee. I was, this is something they hadn't offered another teacher, if I remember correctly, in over 15 years, all because they hoped I would return to teach at their school in 2 to 3 years. When I was teaching abroad in an international school, I was observed teaching a class by an administrator. And during my review of this lesson, he actually asked me if I would be willing to let him teach a lesson in my classroom so I could give him feedback to help him improve as a teacher. And after this is over, feel free to take a look at my digital teaching portfolio featured on my LinkedIn page to get more of a sense of the type of teacher I was. Right? Flash forward to today, I'm healing and I'm reclaiming my life bit by bit, but I do not have any plans to return to the classroom. If I were given the right accommodations, it could absolutely be done, especially if I were working part-time. But I really don't believe this would happen because of the migraine stigma. And it's a real shame. Because when employers and workplace communities do not support people living with migraine, when they do not believe it's a disability, the result could be having highly qualified individuals forced to leave the workplace. On the flip side of this, if employers become educated in migraine and create environments that are migraine friendly and provide accommodations that support employees living with migraine, it could really make all the difference in the world and help people living with migraine not only manage their condition, but succeed while being in the workplace.
Thank you so much for explaining all of that. I completely agree. And I sympathize and I empathize because like you, I have chronic migraine. I have high frequency chronic migraine, meaning that I have over 25 migraine attacks a month or migraine days a month. Usually it's closer to 30 to 31. And my attacks are physically disabling, which for most people who have migraine appears to be invisible. But for me, I live with paralysis. I will lose the ability to speak clearly. I will have a slurred voice. My vision will become doubled. My vision also will be like looking through a kaleidoscope. And it can be very, very difficult to work. But I do have the ability to work when I have the proper accommodations and when I have the flexibility to work when my body is functioning properly. I used to work in fashion, and I had a very long career in fashion, and I pivoted to neurohealth, to working at Neura, because they understood what migraine was like. And some of my roles in the fashion community, I was given accommodations, and that's why I was able to work for so long. And I wanted to share some of these accommodations that have been helpful so that HR managers can understand how they can help their employees who have migraine thrive. Because there are a lot of really accomplished people who, if given the opportunities and the accommodations, they can do an incredible job. So one of the first things, as Bernadette pointed out, was being able to work from home and having that flexibility to work from home. Oftentimes, when you think about reasonable accommodation, people will say, but if I give you this accommodation, what about everyone else in the office? I would respond with, is everyone else in the office disabled in the way that people with migraine are disabled? Are environments as triggering to other people? Are lights as bright to an able-bodied person as they are to someone with migraine? When someone is living with chronic migraine or high-frequency episodic migraine or high-frequency chronic migraine, they are sensitive to environments almost all of the time. Lights are too bright, sounds are too loud. Smells are almost always triggering. And when I say triggering, it means that the people who have these types of migraine are going to be on the verge of having an attack. So having this ability to work from home gives people with migraine the possibility to control their environment and do the work that is expected of them. And every single person I know who has migraine, I've been working in migraine advocacy for a very long time. They want to work, they want to do the job, and they want to do it well. You have highly qualified people who are unable to work and do the job because they are not receiving the proper accommodations. The next thing I want to point out is the formulary list. That's something that a lot of people don't think about, but oftentimes barriers to the medication people with migraine need is within the formulary list. In 2018, there was a huge breakthrough in migraine medication through CGRP inhibitors. And these medications can make living with migraine much easier. But unfortunately, a lot of times on formulary lists, these medications are not included. And so people with migraine have to go through a very long process with insurance to access these medications. So it can take people up to 6 months to a year to get a medication approved. And once you get to a year, you have to go through it again because the insurance plan, cycles through. And so you have a lot of people who need this medication and cannot get it. If they had this medication, it can reduce their number of migraine attacks from 15 migraine attacks in a month to maybe 6 or 7. And that can increase productivity, and that can increase better quality of life. So really think about your formulary list and improving it and expanding it so that people who have migraine or other chronic conditions can be able to work and in the same capacity as people who are able-bodied. The next thing that I would recommend is giving people the flexibility to take breaks and not making a big deal about it. People who have migraine is one of the most stigmatized diseases in the world. And people who have migraine oftentimes feel as though they don't have the flexibility to take a break. At one point when I was working in fashion, the place where I would take a break is I would tell people I was going into the sample closet. And I literally would go into the sample closet and turn off the lights and hide in these massive ball gowns, because that's where it was the most quiet and the most dark. And people would think that I was just working in the sample closet, but that's where I could get the most kind of the safest space for me while I was having an attack. So not making a big deal about people taking breaks. The next thing is having a service dog at work. People don't think that service dogs can be helpful aids when you have migraine, but they absolutely can be. For me, I have a service dog and she gets me to and from the office because I take the subway to work. While she's in the office, she just sleeps all day. So people don't really realize how much of a help she is, but she is the reason why I'm able to get in and out of the office. There are also migraine tools that people need. Bernadette is wearing one of them. I can show you other tools as well. She mentioned neuromodulation devices. Here is one. It's a vagus nerve stimulator. I have another one that I wear on my forehead. And I oftentimes, because I work for a neurology clinic, I now feel like I have the flexibility and the ability to wear this on my head. If I were to work in another space, I would not feel comfortable wearing this device. And this neuromodulation device in particular can usually stop a migraine attack or mute it enough so that I'm able to continue working. And most important, be able to continue speaking. So not making a big deal about people using these devices. It is the same as someone using a wheelchair or using a rollator or using a cane or even wearing glasses. Everybody wears glasses almost, and that is the same as these neuromodulation devices. Also, having the flexibility to go to doctor's appointments or being able to call and talk to insurance without having to use PTO. Excuse me. We need these appointments in order to do our work and in order to thrive. And so if we have to take up our PTO to get these appointments, that's going to add more stress. Stress is one of the biggest triggers for migraine. So just giving people the flexibility to go to a doctor's appointment. Often these appointments are 15 minutes long. Even when they're virtual, like they are at Neura, they're really 15, 20 minutes long and they're done. But those appointments are so critical because people are able to get their medications updated. They're able to get other critical updates with their doctors, and it gives them better quality of life and helps them work better. One of the final things is to really listen to these employees and giving them the environmental accommodations that they need. Everyone is individual. Some people are going to be very light sensitive, like Bernadette. I'm not as light sensitive because of medications that I take. Everyone has individual accommodations that they will need, and just listening to that with empathy and being neutral to whatever it is they need, not making a big deal about it. One of the most helpful things to people with disability is being neutral and just listening and saying, okay, that's what you need, not making a big deal about it. Because people with migraine, every single day of their life, they, on top of living with migraine, are on top of working and living a life just like anyone else does, they have the second job of living with migraine and navigating these disabling symptoms. And then on top of that, living with the stigma of migraine. There are times when I'm on the subway and I'm having a difficult time and people will say, you're not disabled. You don't need a seat. Or if we have the people on the subway who are the It's Showtime boys who are dancing and I ask them to turn down the music or something, I'm criticized and people tell me to take an aspirin. There are all of these things that you're stigmatized for every single day. And so employers need to remember that people who have migraine or other invisible chronic illnesses, they need to have this neutrality and also a level of empathy. Don't make a big deal. And also don't kind of use these disabled employees as kind of a thing to make you feel better about yourself. Oftentimes I've had employers who have been like, this is my disabled employee, and made a big deal about having me as an employee. And then they don't give me the accommodations I need to do my job. And that is not helpful at all. So next, I would like to have Paula explain some more ways that employers can accommodate employees and really make work possible. So take it away, Paula.
All right. Well, thank you, Cannon, and thank you, Bernadette, for sharing your experiences in the workplace. I'm sure those who are on the webinar and have been employees are sitting there nodding, going, yes, yes, when I have to vomit or when I'm misunderstood and I feel the burden of that stigma makes it really difficult. And just a couple of follow-up comments on that. One is that 4 out of 5 bosses did not think that, in a research study, did not think that migraine was a good enough reason to call in sick to work. So that is a statistical reference for people who are in HR thinking, well, is this really a big problem? Yeah, it is really a big problem. And personally, as I was living with migraine and also in the 25 days a month in my corporate career, the first season of my career, as I would like to say, I would, in my first job, I was very open about dealing with migraine. And so that was in my 20s. And then as I got a little bit older and it began to get even worse, I realized that the stigma was the big problem. And so I began to hide it at work. And it is hiding in plain sight, even if you don't think that it's there in your workplace. Stats show us that for women in particular, it's about 1 in 4 in the workplace. You cannot operate a business, particularly in education or healthcare, without employing women. Fashion would be another sector, but in really most sectors, you can't do without that. Military veterans, it's like 1 in 2. LGBTQ, very high rate of migraine. They say also 1 in 2. And those, and among men, it can be around 1 in 10. So the incidence in the workplace of this disorder, which is classified as the second most disabling disorder on the planet by the World Health Education Organization, is real. And you cannot operate an organization without understanding it, which is why we've created so many resources on migraineatwork.org to help people, help both employers and employees figure out how to navigate it. So I'm going to touch upon a couple of those as I get into it. Reasonable accommodations we've been talking about. So what's reasonable? So for the past 20 years, I've been an employer. And I, more recently, I have employed people with migraine and am astounded at how effective they can be when their game is on. But there are some keys to kind of making that happen and doing so at a reasonable level. Reasonable to me as an employer, I think at the bottom line. I think of how much is this going to cost me? You're talking about making accommodations. Well, that's difficult. But actually, there's some studies that indicate that 50%, 57% of the accommodations that we've been talking about for migraine disease don't cost a thing. And then for the remainder, those accommodations cost less than $500 per employee. So if you think about it, the cost of replacing that employee is going to be much higher in terms of hiring someone new, training someone new, and the institutional knowledge that's lost and the relationships that are lost when that person leaves. So it's really essential that organizations figure this out. And we have a ton of resources on migraineatwork.org to help people understand how to do that. So first, recognizing migraine as a disability, thinking about some of the risks to the organization if you have a leader or a team member that cannot perform their job. And there, again, all the research you'll find on this website, but we talk about how 90% of people with migraine say that they cannot perform at their normal productivity, that they have some kind of functional impairment, whether it be physical, as Cannon has talked about, or cognitive, which can happen and then resolve itself. Even the ability to communicate. Sometimes I would be standing in front of a crowd of people speaking, and I'd be spewing out word salad. Like I couldn't quite get my words out the right way. I'd have to step off stage, throw up, and come back and try to, pull it together. It's real. And so understanding that, but understanding you've got a very valuable employee, how can you help them? Well, we'll get into some of those cases in just a second. First, recognize that migraine's a disability, that if you employ people who or are a person who is in a capacity where you're responsible for small children, as in education, you're responsible for patients, as in healthcare, you're responsible for the bottom line and making mistakes. These are things that are significant risks. People in manufacturing, I've interviewed a police officer, and when you can't quite operate normally, this is a risk to the organization. So in my opinion, it's a must do for any organization, and presents risks for the bottom line and OSHA and all kinds of things. We actually have an acronym called SAFER, which boils down all of these accommodations that we've been talking about. It starts with scent protection is the S in SAFER. Many people just cannot function. They're triggered. Their attacks are triggered by workplace scents. And whether we're entitled to a fragrance-free workplace or not is a highly debated thing. But when there's cigarette smoke, body odor, petroleum, I was really responsive to chemical smells like the copier and needed to move away from the copier, right? And certainly perfume is a big problem. I've had to switch airplane seats when I'm traveling on business so that I'm not next to a person who has that. Those are my self-accommodations, but employers can help with that. Second is audio protection. So too much sound, and there's an increasing body of research about the ambient sound and how that really taxes our migraine brains because we're paying attention to everything. And it makes it really painful to live with, as well as the inability to focus when you've got too much ambient sound. Headphones, really cheap, and also an easy accommodation. Flexibility is the F in SAFER, and I'm going to give that a capital F because it deserves it. My life changed when I got flexibility in my job. The ability to work from home periodically was a game changer. Just if I needed to take a break, if I needed to come in a little bit later, leave a little bit earlier. As Cannon said, people with migraine tend to overperform because we feel responsible. And so we plan ahead. We're great teammates because we need to operate with others. We have extraordinary empathy, but flexibility is really key to providing people with migraine the ability to succeed at work. Escape options is E. So many workplaces now provide quiet rooms with no questions asked. And those can be lifesavers for people with migraine because just an ability to go into a quiet, dark space, whether it's in the middle of fashion gowns or it's a teacher's lounge that's not really, highly lit with fluorescent lights, those things really help. And then reduce light. As we just talked about, light can be painful. Thank you so much, Bernadette, for wearing your glasses. I'm in pain right now because I have an extra little light for this webinar that's going off as soon as I'm done. And I'm less sensitive today. But if you're really in a bad place with migraine on any given day, light makes a huge difference, particularly fluorescence. So educating people about migraine is the first step. Migraine at Work is a nonprofit coalition, and there are several different nonprofits that are part of this. A ton of resources on the website that you will see for both employers and employees, where you can help educate people about migraine. We also work with employers and provide free educational webinars for employers that need that. And if you're an employee and you're like, oh my gosh, it's impossible to work with migraine, and I'm just trying to keep my job because I need the insurance and I need the medication and all the things that the job provides me, you might suggest that your company or organization do a webinar to educate everyone about migraine. Because once people understand that it's not just a bad headache that can be resolved with an Advil, they're a lot more empathetic. And unfortunately, migraine is so misunderstood. We're really trying to separate migraine from headache because headache is one of just like 40 symptoms that people can have. And oftentimes not the most disabling. that these educational webinars really help do that in less than an hour. They also create less hostile workplaces, which we're all concerned about these days, and can help you retain talented employees. When I left my corporate career after 22 years at the vice president level, I mean to tell you that I did not attribute it to migraine when I left, and that was a missed opportunity. Because on the way out, I could have said, hey, it was simply impossible for me to function with migraine in this workplace. And I think if they knew that, they might have gone overboard to keep me, as some employers, when I finally admitted what I was dealing with, did. And someone mentioned the comorbidity with mental health, which I know many organizations are really starting to understand now. But people with migraine have a 50% rate of, 50% of them have the comorbidity of depression, and about 80% have the comorbidity of anxiety, because repeated attacks that come out of the blue can make anyone anxious. And even if they're not diagnosed, it is very much a comorbidity that we live with. So if you're focused on mental health, you absolutely need to be focused on migraine, because they travel together. So Cannon, I hope that provides everybody with kind of a basic understanding of the resources that are available to them as employers and employees to really tackle this vexing problem and help decrease our functional impairment in the workplace.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I think it is so important to recognize that accommodations don't just benefit people with migraine, but they will benefit everyone. And as we were kind of chatting through, we were talking about wellness rooms within the comments, and how wellness rooms don't only benefit people with migraine. They can benefit people who are neurodivergent, people who have anxiety. So oftentimes these benefits will help so many other people who are having sensory overload or whatnot. So it's important to remember that these accommodations are not just going to help one person, they're going to help many people. And it's going to make a safer workplace for so many. So now we want to open the conversation to everyone else. So if you have questions, we are so happy to answer them, and we can talk through other topics when it comes to migraine in the workplace. I see that we have a question from Eliza. Do we consider graduate education, such as medical school, a workplace? I would say absolutely. Paula, what's your insight on this?
Yeah, I think if an organization is admitting you to their medical program, you are a valued asset. And goodness knows we need more qualified therapists and doctors and healthcare professionals. So please think about being a board certified headache specialist, because we need more. But yes, you can go. I think education is, while it's a sector that is then very highly ranked, I think number 2 among all sectors with migraine. They're looking at it from an employer standpoint, but they also are looking at it in terms of students. And I had an experience with a student who basically went and got medical leave of absence, medical accommodations, which is really important to talk about. We're talking about accommodations that can keep people functional, but sometimes, and I experienced this myself, I had to take FMLA in order to go to an inpatient clinic and kind of stabilize my migraine. That's something you can request if you are really so severe that you need accommodations or a leave of absence. That is protected. Migraine is protected as a disability, and you can see all of those references either on Migraine at Work or on Migraine World Summit, where we go into in depth all of the different accommodations that employers can provide and the legal protections that are provided to people who have migraine in education as well as in the workplace.
Thank you so much. So we have a question from Kristen. who wants to know, given the point about flexibility with remote work, what is our take on employers mandating that employees come back to the office? Are they hindering work equality? And I would say yes. One of the things that has been incredibly difficult recently is that there's a lot of encouragement to go back into the office. And it's important to remember that people who have migraine or any other chronic condition, first of all, we are at much more risk of complications to our diseases if we were to get COVID, because COVID is still circulating. And so a lot of people who have chronic conditions still would need to work from home so that their condition does not get worse. And mandating that people go back into the office is a safety issue for many who have migraine, or if they're immunocompromised, immunodeficient. And so it does create a problem for people. I would also say that having control of environment is so critical. If people don't have control of their environment, they will not be able to thrive and they will not be able to do the work that they need. I'd love to hear from Bernadette on this because of your particular experience with being a teacher and how not being able to work from home and then shifting into the classroom, how that affected you and how that kind of made you have to make some really big life choices.
Yeah, for sure. Because I also was living with an autoimmune condition that could make me more susceptible to COVID, that was part of the reason why I was able to work from home, why I was given that permission to do so. And the reality is actually my condition became so much more severe because I most likely had COVID right at the start of the pandemic in March of 2020. And like Cannon was just saying, it can have a huge impact on those of us living with migraine disease and cause a very big progression and exacerbation of our symptoms. And all of that can be avoided if we have the ability to work from home. It's a huge gift. And at the time I was teaching learning support, my classes were at most, I had 3 students. I was teaching in such an intimate environment that it wasn't lost that I was working from home. And I had such a successful year as a teacher. My students were thriving, I was thriving. It was a gift. And when they took away that ability to work remotely, and as a teacher, obviously it's more complicated. It's different than a corporate environment. This idea of working from home, you really have to think outside of the box to kind of have an employer agree to that. But, and I was teaching older students. My kids were 17, 16, 18, they were older. They could handle sitting in a classroom and working with me one-to-one in this manner. And they did great. I did great. But once that was taken away from me, there was no chance of me returning to work. I physically couldn't commute at that point.
That's such a good point, because not being able to get to work is a big problem. And again, people who have migraine want to work. They want to thrive in the office, and creating these barriers is taking incredibly talented people away from the office place. And you are losing people who are a big asset to your company. And then, as Paula pointed out earlier, you are going to have to spend the money to train new employees who may not be as qualified as the person who you currently have employed. So it is so critical to give these accommodations. And working from home, we learned it's not a big deal. People are able to do it. And not making a big deal about working from home is a really great asset. So we have a question from Alyssa, who is wanting to know about applying for a job and successfully getting a job, and kind of the work support needs and work culture and all of that. I even would take into thought the application process and kind of how from start to finish when applying for a job, what that feels like to kind of the first few months of working. Paula, if you want to start off with that. And kind of describe how people can ask for reasonable accommodation process is like. And I can also go into the application process, and Bernadette, I'm sure you will want to have some POV on that.
Yeah. So applying for a job when you know you have migraine, and this makes a big difference in what the workplace environment is, and whether you'll be given that kind of flexibility or accommodation. These are difficult things to bring up in the interview process without somebody going, maybe a different candidate would be better, because you haven't really proven yourself yet. You have to have a reasonable estimation of your worth. So if you're a cybersecurity consultant, you can probably be very plain about it. If you are easily replaced, and there are a lot of people that do what you do, maybe you don't bring it up during the interview process. Maybe you look on Glassdoor, maybe you network your way into a couple of people who are in the company or in the organization, where you can find out what's it really like to work in this organization. Confide in them, tell them that what you're dealing with and what your level of disability or functional impairment is, and then see what they say about the accommodations. We talked about, can you ask what's on the formulary? No, you really can't. That's just awkward in an interview conversation. Can you ask if there is a quiet room on site? Yeah, I'd ask that. Can you ask what your workspace might be like? Yes, you can ask that, and then make your own decision about what it's like. Can you ask, are there employees that require in your organization that have that are able to work from home? And what is your policy about that? Yes, you can ask those questions. Those are all good things. But what I would do is the person that's going to be my boss, I would try to feel them out and see, are they an empathetic, understanding person who can be easily educated, or are they kind of, a jerk or a taskmaster? The person you work for can make a huge difference in either fighting for you or making your life hell. And so you really just need to understand who you're working for and what you believe they can do for you once you're hired and have proven yourself.
Thank you for that. So Alyssa has kind of chimed in a little bit more, saying that she has gotten her master's and she has been trying to apply for jobs since then. I have been in your shoes, Alyssa. And what I've learned is when you are going through the application process, there's the disclosure of being disabled. And a lot of times HR departments will say, we use this because we want to have disabled employees in the company. I have personally found anytime I say or indicate that I am disabled on my application, I do not hear from that company. If I don't say anything, if I just remain neutral, if I say that I don't want to answer that question, I will most of the time get a response. That is my first recommendation, and it's a really horrible thing to face. And then I also found that throughout the interview process, especially when I'm speaking with people who are in HR, I really try to keep my questions more limited. I will ask more about like PTO and what that PTO includes. And if it includes, if it's like an unlimited PTO, how many days of like sick days you get or vacation days that you get, because oftentimes people who have migraine, they are going to use up their sick days, and then they're also going to be using up their vacation days due to having migraine attacks. And that's really not fair. We need to be able to take breaks as well so that we can recover and have good quality of life and have less stress. So it's important to kind of go through some of these more basic questions. And then once you're hired, that's when you can go through more of the process of asking for the accommodations. Bernadette, what's your insight into what it's like to apply and asking for those accommodations? What was that like as being a teacher? Because you do have to be on site most of the time.
Yeah, my situation was really different because I was living in the Netherlands at the time when I had my severe progression. And in the Netherlands, there is a system for this where you can go on sick leave if you need sick leave, and you don't even have to put in paperwork. There's an ARBO doctor. Every company, right, has an ARBO doctor, and they are not directly affiliated with the school or the company. They're an outside entity, and they are monitoring health and workplace issues. And your company has to listen to their recommendations. So in my case, it was clear that I should not be back on campus because of the severe progression I had, and also my risk to COVID and how that could make things worse. And it was very clear that in order for me to work and work well, I needed to be working from home. And the way that works, so that was my accommodation that year, was through the ARBO doctor. And then the following year, when they removed that ability to work from home completely, then it was a conversation with my HR department, where they were the ones that actually said to me, because again, there's a system for this. They said, you know, we think you should take the full year off. You tried to work and heal at the same time. It didn't work. We think you need at least the full year to try to recover from this, which is amazing. Like, what a gift. And still, it was hard for me to accept that because I always put my job before my own health. If they hadn't said that to me, I'm not sure where I would be today, but yeah, there's a system for it. And you still don't have to put paperwork through that whole first year. You get to go on sick leave. It was my second year where I had to then submit 3 doctors that had to talk about my prognosis and what I was going through. And then from there, it was a decision made on my case. And the decision was made that I needed the second year of sick leave. So it's just different when you live in a country where there's systems in place for this, opposed to here where you're just really advocating on your own. And that's a big part of the reason why I haven't returned to the classroom here, why I'm not trying to. I am deciding to kind of create something for myself. That way I have full control over things and I don't have to rely. And that's not fair to do to people, right? It would be it would be great if I could feel comfortable to return to the classroom and say, you know, yeah, I can be on campus, but when I'm not teaching, I need the freedom to be off campus if I'm having a migraine attack, rather than being, you know, obligated by contract to be on campus from 15 minutes before and 15 minutes after the bell rings, like little things like that. So it's a little different, but.
Cannon, I wanted to jump in and just say that there are some self-accommodations that people can do without necessarily disclosing that they have migraine. So this is good for new hires, and it's also good for people who feel like they're in a hostile workplace and they can't disclose it without putting their job at risk. So the glasses actually that Bernadette's wearing right now, no one's going to fire you for wearing FL41 tinted glasses. This is a specific tint of glasses that actually is researched to prevent the kinds of light that irritate people with migraine. So that's one thing. And another thing is noise canceling headphones. When you are particularly vulnerable, not all the time, but when you're particularly vulnerable, you could put those in to reduce that external thing. Scent is a little bit more difficult to escape from, and many people complain about that. But those are some self-accommodations that people can do in those situations.
Another thing, so with Migraine at Work, one of the things that I found most helpful on your website is the assistance and guidance that y'all provide for employees and the reasonable accommodation process. And I just wanted you to kind of walk through that, because we did have some people who are asking about, does your doctor need to be involved when you request reasonable accommodation? How much do you need to disclose? Do you need to say that you have a disability? Can you go into that? Because that's one of the best things that y'all have for kind of the employee side.
Yeah, as an employee, if you are dealing with disabling migraine attacks that are impairing your ability to function on the job, your physician can be your best ally. As everyone who has migraine probably knows, but those who don't have it don't know, migraine is a spectrum disorder. And so you can have attacks, 2 days a month, you can have attacks 25 days a month. The three of us here speaking right now have all been or are in chronic migraine, which is that over half of the days of the month. But that is the exception. And as Bernadette pointed out, it can progress. So when I first started getting attacks, it was like, maybe 3 or 4 days a month. And I was impaired by those because my medication did not help me resolve the attacks, right? Today, and this goes back to the formulary, we have a much better options in terms of new therapies that have come out that help more people. So for probably the past 20 years, I've been able to resolve my attacks by using medication and reduce my attacks by using a wide variety of tools that are now available to us. But going back to your original question about what kind of resources do you need, your doctor can provide a letter of medical necessity. If you need accommodations, if you are in fact severely impaired and medication or other devices do not help you resolve your attacks, your doctor can provide a letter of medical necessity that you can provide to your employer. And because it's protected in the United States and other countries, perhaps like the Netherlands, I don't know all the international regulations, you can take that to your employer to get the accommodations that you need and to justify it, right? Because oftentimes they want to know, and this is part of educating them. If you don't have familiarity with that, you can see there's a couple of webinars and things that we have, interviews with Aimed Alliance, which is a leading legal organization. The Job Accommodation Network is another one. It's very good. There's a downloadable, your Bill of Rights, basically, as an employee that will help both the employee understand what their rights are in the workplace, as well as the employer know, hey, what should we be providing, both at an ethical and legal level, as well as to retain our best people, because migraine does not discriminate. It affects people who are, very talented and people who you might not want to retain, right? It's across the spectrum. And so as an employer, we make those decisions not based on someone's health, but on someone's value. So I often encourage people with migraine to do something that you're really good at and to get into a space where you're providing value. If you're providing value, the risk of you being, let go because in a bad economy because you're not, able to keep up is very low if you're providing value. So provide value wherever you can to the best of your ability, and don't feel that kind of self-stigma that Bernadette talked about what you have. You have a genetic neurological disease. It is not your fault, and you are entitled to rights in the workplace. So understand what those are and then operate within those parameters.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to chime in. Gianna said something really important in that you don't have to disclose that you have migraine when asking for reasonable accommodation. It depends on a state by state level. So to look into that and find out what it is that you necessarily have to share. Most of the times it's just what accommodations you need. And that's why programs like Migraine at Work are so critical, so that the employers learn how to accommodate people with migraine without the people who have migraine having to disclose and endure a lot of the stigma that they already are going through on a daily basis. And if employers just automatically had these safe spaces, wellness rooms, and all of these other things that could make life a lot easier, having a scent-free workplace, not having fluorescent lights, just having that across the board, because remember, 1 in 4 women have migraine, 1 in 7 people have migraine, then people who have migraine will not feel as stigmatized in the workplace, and they won't feel like they are having to share as much, which will reduce stress and likely reduce their number of migraine days. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This has been a really lovely conversation. And again, if you ever have questions about migraine and work, Highly recommend going to migraineatwork.org. Is that the correct URL?
Migraineatwork.org. Yes,
Yeah.
it is a project of the World Health Education Foundation, which is our nonprofit.
Yes, go in there to learn more about accommodating in the workspace. And then another thing that we're quite passionate about at NeuroHealth is educating employers about how to accommodate, and then also following Bernadette at Chronic Accounts on Instagram, because there's so much information you can learn about migraine from her. And then finally, watching the Migraine World Summit once a year, which is another program that Paula runs, and really involves a lot of different doctors and medical professionals to educate about migraine. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to be doing more of these lives in the future.